The alien princess, Saria, was the last hope of the once thriving planet of Elendor. She stood at the pinnacle of her species, a regal figure with skin that shimmered like the night sky and eyes that glowed with an inner light, reflecting the wisdom of countless generations. Her people revered her, not just for her beauty, but for her leadership, a beacon of peace and prosperity. Elendor was a jewel in the galaxy, a world of advanced technology harmoniously intertwined with nature, where towering spires of crystal rose from lush forests and rivers of liquid light flowed through the cities. But all that was before the invasion. The day the sky darkened with the shadow of enemy ships, everything changed. The attack came without warning, a sudden and brutal onslaught from the Targ, a warlike species driven by greed and a thirst for conquest. Their ships descended upon Elendor like a swarm of locusts, raining destruction on the once peaceful cities. Saria watched in horror as the elegant spires crumbled and the rivers of light were snuffed out, replaced by plumes of smoke and ash. Amid the chaos, Saria's trusted advisor, Zarlek, approached her with urgent news. His voice was calm, too calm, as he spoke of a secret escape route that would take her to safety. But something in his eyes betrayed him, an icy detachment that made Saria hesitate. Before she could react, Zarlek struck. The betrayal was swift and unexpected, his blade a flash of cold metal that tore through the fabric of her royal gown and into her side. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was a realization of the betrayal that hurt more. Zarlek's voice, once full of loyalty and respect, now dripped with contempt as he revealed his true allegiance. The Targ had promised him power, a position of influence in their new regime. In exchange, he had delivered Elendor's defenses into their hands, and now sought to erase its last hope, Saria herself. Left for dead, Saria was dragged to the outskirts of her ruined city and abandoned in a desolate wasteland. The Targ, convinced of her imminent death, left without a second glance. The once vibrant landscape of Elendor had turned into a hostile environment, a wasteland of jagged rocks and barren soil, devoid of the life that once thrived there. Saria, weakened and bleeding, struggled to move, each breath a painful reminder of her betrayal. As the hours passed, the initial shock of Zarlek's treachery gave way to a grim determination. Saria knew she had to survive, if not for herself, then for the memory of her people. But the wasteland offered no comfort. Only cold winds and the distant echoes of a civilization now lost. She tried to tap into her remaining energy reserves, but the pain from her wound was overwhelming, sapping her strength and clouding her thoughts. The Elendorian princess, once surrounded by luxury and adoration, now lay on the hard, unyielding ground, her elegant robes torn and stained with blood. She was no longer a beacon of hope, but a flickering light on the verge of being extinguished. The planet's twin moons rose slowly in the sky, casting a pale glow over the desolate landscape, their light dimly illuminating Saria's weakened form. In her delirium, Saria's mind drifted to memories of her childhood, of the lessons her mother had taught her about resilience and the unbreakable spirit of their people. But those lessons felt distant now, like a faint whisper from a time that no longer existed. As the cold night air closed in, Saria's thoughts turned darker. Would this be her end, alone and forgotten on a dying world? For hours, she lay there, struggling against the inevitable. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the faces of her people, and that thought kept her awake, kept her fighting. But as the night grew colder and the pain more intense, Saria began to lose hope. Her vision blurred, and the stars above seemed to swirl together, the darkness pressing in around her. Her breathing slowed, and the last of her strength ebbed away, leaving her teetering on the brink of unconsciousness. Just as her eyes began to close for what she thought would be the last time, Saria heard something, a faint sound, almost imperceptible over the howling wind. At first, she thought it was a trick of her dying mind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was a soft padding of footsteps approaching her through the darkness. Saria forced her eyes open one last time, trying to discern the source of the sound. Her vision was clouded, her senses dulled. But she could make out a shape moving toward her, a small, four-legged creature, its outline faint against the harsh landscape. A sense of confusion and curiosity stirred within her. Was this some creature come to finish her off, or was it something else? The figure moved closer, and Saria's heart, though weak, beat a little faster. She could see it now, closer, clearer. It was unlike any being she had seen on Elendor, yet there was something oddly familiar about it, as if from a distant memory she couldn't quite place. The creature, a dog, had been wandering the desolate terrain of Elendor for days, surviving on sheer instinct. He was a strong, intelligent creature, a German shepherd perhaps, though in this alien landscape, the distinctions of breed seemed insignificant. He had once been part of a human crew, loyal to his masters as they explored the unknown reaches of the galaxy. But when their ship had been caught in the crossfire of the Targ invasion, the dog had been separated from his people, left to fend for himself on a planet that was not his own. He was a survivor, hardened by the loss of his pack and the unforgiving environment that now surrounded him. His fur, once sleek and well-kept, was now matted and dusty, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger or hope. Despite the harsh conditions, the dog had managed to find sustenance, scavenging what little he could from the remnants of the devastated planet. It was during one of these scavenging expeditions that he had come across the scent. Faint but distinct, it led him to the alien princess. As he approached, his keen senses detected something different about her, something familiar, yet entirely foreign. She wasn't like the humans he had known, but there was a gentleness in her that he recognized, a vulnerability that spoke to his innate protective instincts. The dog paused a few feet away from the princess, his head cocked to one side as he observed her. She lay still, her breathing shallow and labored, her once glimmering skin now dull and marked with the evidence of her suffering. He took a cautious step closer, his nose twitching as he picked up the scent of blood and despair. Something deep within him stirred, a drive to protect, to comfort, that had not faded even in the face of overwhelming odds. With a soft whine, the dog inched closer, his body low to the ground as if trying to make himself appear as non-threatening as possible. Saria, barely conscious, sensed his presence and slowly turned her head to look at him. Her vision was blurry, her mind clouded by pain and exhaustion, but she could make out the creature's shape, its warm eyes glowing softly in the dim light. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, two beings from vastly different worlds, brought together by circumstances neither could have foreseen. The dog, sensing her fear and confusion, gently nuzzled her hand with his nose. The touch was warm, grounding her in the present, pulling her back from the edge of unconsciousness. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it meant everything. Saria, her voice barely a whisper, murmured a word in her native tongue, a word that meant friend. She didn't know if the creature understood her, but it didn't matter. The dog, as if responding to her call, moved closer, pressing his body against her side to share his warmth. His fur was coarse and unkempt, but it was a comfort nonetheless, a reminder that she was not alone in this barren wasteland. The dog settled beside her, his head resting on his paws, his eyes alert to any potential danger. As the night wore on, he stayed by her side, his presence a constant source of comfort and companionship. Saria, too weak to move, let herself lean into the warmth he offered, her mind slowly beginning to clear as the pain receded into a dull ache. Hours passed in relative silence, the only sounds the distant howling of the wind and the dog's steady breathing. The princess, though still exhausted, felt a small spark of hope reignite within her. This creature, this unexpected rescuer, had not only saved her from the cold, but had given her a reason to keep fighting. She could feel the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment, a silent understanding that transcended language and species. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape, Saria knew she could not stay in this place any longer. She had to move, to find a way off this doomed planet. But she also knew she couldn't do it alone. The dog, as if sensing her thoughts, stood up and stretched, his muscles rippling beneath his matted fur. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination, as if to say, "We'll do this together." Summoning what little strength she had left, Saria managed to push herself into a sitting position. The dog moved to her side, steadying her with his presence. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, and placed it on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to solidify the bond between them. Saria knew their journey would not be easy. The planet was still under Targ control, and the wasteland offered little in the way of resources or shelter. But with the dog by her side, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had survived the betrayal of her people, the fall of her kingdom, and the desolation of her world. Now, with this loyal creature as her companion, she would find a way to escape, to rebuild, and perhaps to one day reclaim what was lost. As the two of them set off together, leaving the barren wasteland behind, the dog stayed close to her side, his every step in tune with hers. They moved forward, not just as unlikely allies, but as something more, a team united by a shared will to survive and a growing bond that neither of them could have ever anticipated. Saria and the dog traveled to the ravaged landscape, their bond growing with each step. The princess, though still weak, had regained a sense of purpose. The dog's presence was a constant reminder that she was not alone, that there was still hope, however faint. Together, they navigated the treacherous terrain, avoiding the remnants of tarred patrols and scavenging what little they could from the ruins of Elendor. Days passed in a blur of movement and survival. Saria's strength slowly returned, fueled by her determination to escape this planet and reclaim her throne. The dog, ever vigilant, guided her through the wasteland, his instincts sharp and unerring. He led her to hidden sources of water, to caves where they could rest, and away from the dangers that lurked in the shadows. He was more than just a companion. He was her protector, her guide in a world that had turned against her. As they journeyed, Saria's mind raced with thoughts of revenge. The memory of Zarlek's betrayal burned within her, fueling her resolve. She had once believed in mercy, in diplomacy, but that was before she had been left to die, before her people had been slaughtered. Now, all she wanted was to make those responsible pay. One night, as they rested beneath the shelter of a rocky outcrop, Saria turned her gaze to the dog, who lay beside her, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. She reached out, placing a hand on his back, and spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of her resolve. "We must find a way off this planet," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion that still lingered. "We can't stay here, not with the Targ still searching for survivors. But I will not leave until I've made Zarlek pay for what he's done." The dog looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. Though he could not speak, Saria felt as though he understood her. There was a shared understanding between them now, a silent agreement that they would see this through together. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. While scouting ahead one day, the dog led her to a vantage point overlooking a small Targ outpost. It was a temporary structure, hastily erected amid the ruins, but it housed something that made Saria's heart skip a beat. A Targ dropship, sleek and deadly, capable of breaching the atmosphere and carrying them far from Elendor. Saria crouched low, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. The outpost was lightly guarded, the Targ soldiers unaware of any immediate threat. They were overconfident, certain that they had already crushed all resistance on the planet. But Saria knew better. She had spent her life studying strategy, learning to exploit the weaknesses of her enemies, and now, with the dog by her side, she had the means to strike. "We'll have to move quickly," she whispered to the dog, who sat beside her, his ears perked up in anticipation. "If we can take out the guards, we can steal that ship and get off this cursed planet. But we must be silent, Swift. There's no room for error." The dog seemed to understand. He was a creature of action, born to protect and serve, and now he had a new mission to help Saria reclaim her throne. Together, they crept down from their vantage point, moving through the shadows like ghosts. Saria's heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was clear, focused. She had one chance to make this work, and she would not fail. They reached the perimeter of the outpost, where 2 Targ soldiers stood guard. Saria signaled to the dog, who darted forward with a silent grace, his powerful jaws clamping down on the nearest guard's throat before he could make a sound. Saria moved in tandem, using a sharp shard of crystal she had found among the ruins to disable the second guard. The Targ fell without a cry, their lifeless bodies crumpling to the ground. Saria allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction before moving on. They were close now, so close. The dropship was just ahead, its engines powered down, the cockpit unguarded. But as they approached, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows, Zarlek, flanked by 2 Targ officers, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "So, you survived after all," Zarlek sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I should have known you'd be too stubborn to die quietly." Saria's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the shard of crystal. The dog growled low in his throat, sensing the tension in the air. Zarlek's eyes flicked to the dog, a hint of surprise crossing his features before he dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "It doesn't matter," Zarlek continued, drawing a weapon from his belt. "You'll die here, just like the rest of your pathetic people, and I will watch as your world burns." Saria felt a surge of anger, hot and consuming, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had waited for this moment, had prepared for it. Zarlek had underestimated her once, but he would not do so again. Without a word, Saria lunged forward, the dog at her side, moving as one. Zarlek's surprise was his downfall. He hesitated, just for a moment, and that was all she needed. The shard of crystal found its mark, plunging into Zarlek's chest with a sickening crunch. His eyes widened in shock as he staggered back, the weapon slipping from his grasp. The Targ officers moved to intervene, but the dog was faster. He leaped at the nearest one, his powerful jaws tearing into the alien's throat, while Saria retrieved Zarlek's fallen weapon and fired at the other. The battle was brief, brutal, and when it was over, Saria stood over Zarlek's lifeless body, her chest heaving with exertion. She looked down at him, the traitor who had cost her everything, and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. "This is for my people," she whispered, turning away from the body. The dog, his muzzle stained with the blood of their enemies, came to her side, his eyes locked on hers. "We're not done yet," Saria said, her voice resolute. She moved toward the dropship, the dog following closely behind. As they boarded the craft and prepared to take off, Saria felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the invasion began. She had survived the fall of her world, reclaimed her strength, and now, with her loyal companion, she was ready to take back what was rightfully hers. The dropship's engines roared to life, lifting them off the ground and into the sky. As they soared above the ruined landscape of Elendor, Saria looked out at the world below, her mind already planning her next move. The war was far from over, but now she had a new ally and a reason to fight. With the dog by her side, Saria knew she would one day return to Elendor, not as a fallen princess, but as a queen ready to rebuild and reclaim her throne.